3. Frequency tables. In this video, you will learn how to create frequency distribution tables in Excel for both qualitative and quantitative data. A frequency distribution table is a type of descriptive statistic. These tables describe a dataset by providing an overview of every possible value of a variable and how often it occurs in the dataset. If you look at your start file, you'll see towards the bottom there is a frequency distribution table for the variable salesperson. Salesperson is a qualitative variable. You can see that the data is naturally expressed in words, and we can go through the dataset and identify categories. Again, frequency distribution tables provide an overview of all the different values or possible categories of a variable. These are all the different sales employees in the dataset. What we're going to do is we're going to figure out the frequency or how often each employee occurs in the dataset. Essentially, we are determining the number of vehicles each salesperson has made. In order to determine the frequency, we are going to use the COUNTIFs function in Excel. This function tells Excel to scan a data array and determine how many cells meet a certain criterion. In order to write this function, we have to indicate what the criterion range is. This is the data that Excel is going to scan. In our case, this is the salesperson column. We are going to want to use absolute referencing. We want to fix both the columns and the rows so that we can copy the function down. Next, we need to indicate what the criteria is. For the first frequency, it's going to be Joe Tanner. We are going to use relative referencing, so we want the criterion to change as we copy the function down. This function is telling Excel to count the number of cells in the salesperson column that have the text Joe Tanner in it. And you can see that the frequency is 18. This means Joe Tanner has sold 18 cars. We can copy this function down. And we can check to see that each function is referencing the correct salesperson. Then we will use the sum function to total all of the frequencies. Finally, we will determine the percentage of sales made by each salesperson. To do this, we will divide the frequency by the total number of sales. And we are going to want to use absolute referencing for this cell, so we want to fix this cell. Then we can copy our function down and format the data as percentage. We are also going to want to middle align and center justify our data. The next frequency table is going to summarize the data on selling price. Selling price is a quantitative variable. The data is numerical and the numbers represent the amount of money. When creating a frequency table for quantitative data, it is often beneficial to create what is called a grouped frequency table. A grouped frequency table has intervals or classes. Creating these makes the table much more manageable. If each possible selling price had its own row, the table would be way too long. Instead, we create intervals or a range of selling price. This shortens up the table and describes the data in a much more manageable way. We will use the COUNTIFs function again to determine the frequency. What we want to do is we want to tell Excel to count the number of selling prices that are between $0 and $25,000. First, we will indicate the criterion range, which is the selling price. We are going to use absolute referencing, so we can copy our function down. Then we are going to indicate our first criteria. Our first criteria is that we're looking for a selling price that is equal to or greater than $0. So we're going to put greater or equal to in quotations, then the and symbol, and then the lower limit. Then we are going to put our second criteria range in. That is also going to be selling price. We are going to use absolute referencing. And then we're going to put in our second criterion, which is the upper limit. So we are looking for a selling price that is less than or equal to, we will put that in quotations, plus and then the upper limit. And then we can close the parentheses. And you can see that the frequency is 0. Then we should be able to copy our function down. And you can see that it's referencing the correct lower and upper limit. We can use the sum function to total the frequencies. And then we can determine the percentage. That would be the frequency divided by the total number. And again, we're going to want to use absolute referencing for the total number. We can copy this function down and format the data as percentages. So you can see 23% of the sales had a selling price between $25,000 and $50,000. 35% of the cars sold had a selling price between $50,000 and $75,000. Next, we're going to determine the cumulative percentage. Cumulative percentage is the percentage of data that falls at that interval plus all the previous intervals. You can think of it as a running total. In order to compute the cumulative percentage, we are going to take the percentage of that interval and add it to the previous interval's cumulative percentage. The cumulative percentage for the first interval is the percentage plus the previous interval's cumulative percentage. However, there is not a previous interval. That means for the first row, the cumulative percentage is going to be the same as the percentage. For the second interval, we're going to take the percentage and add it to the cumulative percentage of the previous interval. For the third, we're going to do the same, the percentage plus the cumulative percentage for the previous interval. And then we should be able to copy the function down. Again, cumulative percentage is telling us the percentage of data at that interval and the previous intervals. So 23% of the data falls at this interval and the previous interval. In other words, 23% of the cars sold had a selling price of $50,000 or less. 58% of the cars sold had a selling price of $75,000 or less. 83% of the cars sold had a selling price of $100,000 or less, and 100% of the cars sold had a selling price of $125,000 or less. Finally, we are going to want to format our data. We're going to want to make sure that it's middle aligned and justified. In summary, this video demonstrated how to create frequency tables in Excel for both qualitative and quantitative data.